The truth is, most people misunderstand this. We wander through the hyper-commercialized landscapes of our modern world under the heavy, deeply ingrained delusion that the deliberate accumulation of physical objects is the ultimate, undeniable metric of human success, security, and happiness. We are systematically taught from the moment we can comprehend language that to be more, we must possess more. The societal narrative demands that we constantly expand our physical footprint, filling our homes, our garages, and our deeply exhausted minds with an endless, staggering avalanche of consumer goods. We falsely believe that a larger television will somehow broadcast a more fulfilling existence, that an overflowing wardrobe will finally armor us against our crippling insecurities, and that a towering library of unread books will silently project an aura of profound intellectual depth to anyone who happens to glance at our shelves. But the profoundly transformative narrative embedded within the philosophy of this journey violently shatters this ancient, toxic illusion, exposing it as a tragic, suffocating trap that keeps millions of capable, brilliant individuals chained to a state of chronic anxiety and stagnant mediocrity. The story introduces a powerful, paradigm-shifting archetype, a figure we shall call the minimalist, whose extraordinary, painful, and ultimately liberating psychological evolution completely redefines the mechanical physics of contentment, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that true, unassailable freedom is found not in the relentless addition of things, but in the ruthless, incredibly courageous act of subtraction. The narrative origins of the minimalist do not begin in a pristine, perfectly curated, and aesthetically flawless Zen temple. They begin in the grimy, unforgiving, and deeply chaotic reality of a suffocatingly cramped, heavily cluttered apartment in the dense, concrete heart of Tokyo. The protagonist of this archetype was the quintessential, tragic product of modern consumerism. His living space was absolutely not a sanctuary of rest and rejuvenation, it was a dark, claustrophobic warehouse of deferred dreams and compounding guilt. The physical environment was a terrifying, chaotic reflection of his internal psychological state. Everywhere he looked, his vision was aggressively assaulted by towering, precarious mountains of physical objects. There were shelves buckling under the immense weight of hundreds of books that he had purchased in fits of aspirational intellectualism but had never actually summoned the energy to open. There was a collection of incredibly expensive, complex vintage cameras sitting on a desk, their lenses permanently clouded with a thick layer of dust, representing a passionate hobby that he had completely abandoned years ago. There were antique guitars leaning awkwardly in the corners of the room, their strings rusted and untuned, silent witnesses to the creative musician he desperately wished to be but never actually became. The floor was an obstacle course of discarded clothing, unopened mail, and half-empty beverage containers. He could not walk from his bed to the bathroom without physically stepping over the heavy, physical manifestations of his own financial impulsivity. He was drowning, not in water, but in the overwhelming, crushing density of his own possessions. He would wake up every single morning feeling a profound, unexplainable exhaustion before he even placed his feet on the cluttered floor. He lived in a state of constant, low-grade panic, frequently comparing his messy, seemingly pathetic existence to the highly curated, impossibly perfect, and entirely artificial lives of his peers broadcasted relentlessly on social media platforms. To numb this agonizing, gnawing sense of profound inadequacy, he would engage in a destructive, cyclical routine. He would consume excessive amounts of alcohol in the dim, depressing light of his cluttered room, and in his inebriated, vulnerable state, he would open his laptop and purchase even more objects. He would buy rare CDs, vintage clothing, and novel gadgets, desperately chasing the brief, intoxicating, and chemically induced spike of dopamine that always accompanied the click of the checkout button. But this synthetic happiness was incredibly fleeting. The very moment the cardboard boxes arrived at his doorstep, the thrill would instantly evaporate, rapidly replaced by a heavy, sinking feeling of deep regret as he realized he now had to find a place to store yet another useless object in a room that was already violently rejecting his presence. Analyzing this incredibly painful, deeply relatable phase of the protagonist's life reveals a profound, Terrifying psychological concept that lies at the very core of modern anxiety, the devastating, invisible burden of the silent to-do list. The prevailing, naive assumption is that inanimate objects are entirely passive. We believe that a book sitting on a shelf or a camera resting on a desk is simply dead matter occupying physical space. But the narrative brilliantly and ruthlessly deconstructs this myth, exposing the terrifying reality that objects possess a powerful, invisible voice. They are constantly, relentlessly transmitting psychological frequencies that our exhausted brains are forced to process. When the protagonist looked at his dusty guitar, it did not sit silently, it aggressively screamed at him. Why aren't you practicing? You spent a fortune on me. And you are wasting your potential. When his eyes brushed past the stack of unread philosophy books, they silently whispered, you are lazy, you are uneducated, you are falling behind. Every single object he owned required maintenance, cleaning, organization, and, most devastatingly, psychological bandwidth. The sheer volume of these silent, demanding voices created a deafening, paralyzing cognitive overload. His energy was constantly being siphoned away by the very things he had purchased to bring him joy. He was completely paralyzed by the staggering volume of his own possessions. Unable to focus, unable to relax, and entirely unable to simply exist in the present moment without feeling the crushing, invisible weight of 1,000 uncompleted tasks radiating from the clutter surrounding him. The psychological analysis deepens as the narrative forces us to confront the fundamental, evolutionary reasons why human beings are so fiercely, irrationally driven to accumulate and hoard physical matter. For millennia, in the harsh, unforgiving environments of our ancient ancestors, the accumulation of physical resources, food, tools, animal skins, was a literal matter of life and death. The human brain was evolutionarily hardwired to equate hoarding with absolute biological survival. However, in the modern, hyper-abundant environment, this ancient survival mechanism has severely, tragically malfunctioned. We no longer accumulate out of physical necessity, we accumulate to project complex, abstract messages to our social tribe. We buy incredibly expensive, highly depreciating luxury vehicles not for transportation, but to silently scream to the world that we have achieved dominance and high social status. We fill our homes with obscure cultural artifacts to project an illusion of worldly sophistication. Furthermore, we use objects as a desperate, tragic mechanism to construct an idealized future self. The protagonist bought the vintage cameras for the adventurous, artistic photographer he wished to be. He bought the dense books for the articulate, intellectual scholar he hoped to become. The devastating tragedy of this behavior is that purchasing the object is incredibly easy, but doing the grueling, unglamorous work to actually become that idealized person is incredibly hard. Therefore, the idealized self never actually arrives, leaving the protagonist trapped in a room filled with the physical, decaying corpses of his own unfulfilled promises. The objects do not represent his success, they are heavy, undeniable monuments to his failures. As the protagonist slowly, agonizingly became aware of this suffocating psychological dynamic, his internal crisis was violently accelerated by two external, undeniable realities that finally shattered his paralysis. The first reality was deeply financial and profoundly absurd. Residing in Tokyo, he was living in one of the most expensive, highly competitive real estate markets on the entire planet. He was working grueling, soul-crushing hours at a highly stressful job, trading the absolute best, most vibrant years of his finite mortality for currency. He subjected himself to the daily, humiliating torture of packing into overflowing, silent commuter trains, enduring the crushing pressure of corporate expectations, all to earn a paycheck that was immediately devoured by his monthly rent. But as he looked around his cramped apartment, he made a sickening, world-altering calculation. He realized that the vast majority of his expensive square footage was not actually being used by him, it was being exclusively occupied by his towering piles of useless, untouched objects. He was literally sacrificing his life energy, working himself to the point of utter exhaustion, merely to pay exorbitant rent to house a massive collection of inanimate objects that actively made him miserable. He was not the master of his domain, he was a terrified, exhausted landlord providing extremely expensive, subsidized housing for his own garbage. The sheer, mathematical absurdity of this arrangement struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was bleeding out financially just to maintain his own psychological prison. The second reality that forcefully catalyzed his awakening was geographical and deeply biologically terrifying. Japan is an island nation situated on incredibly volatile, violent tectonic plates. The constant, looming threat of massive, catastrophic earthquakes is an inescapable fact of daily existence. The protagonist suddenly looked at his living space not through the lens of a consumer, but through the lens of pure, primal survival. He stared at the massive, heavy wooden bookshelves that reached the ceiling, groaning under the weight of hundreds of thick, hardcover volumes. He looked at the precarious stacks of heavy stereo equipment and the dense, chaotic piles of objects blocking the narrow pathways to the exit. He realized, with a sudden, icy wave of sheer terror, that in the event of a major seismic event, his apartment would instantly transform into a highly lethal, inescapable death trap. The very objects he had spent his life accumulating to make him feel secure and successful would become heavy, blunt force weapons that would violently crush the life out of his body. His possessions were not just stealing his psychological peace and his financial resources, they were actively, silently threatening his literal, physical survival. The room was a loaded gun pointed directly at his head, and he was the one who had meticulously, foolishly loaded every single bullet. The convergence of this profound psychological realization, the sickening financial absurdity, and the acute, terrifying physical danger pushed the protagonist to the absolute, undeniable breaking point. The heavy, comforting delusion of consumerism was completely, permanently stripped away, leaving only a raw, burning, and incredibly powerful revulsion. He could no longer tolerate the suffocating presence of his own accumulations. He stood in the dead center of his chaotic, shrinking room, the air thick with dust and the silent, screaming voices of 1,000 unfulfilled obligations. The anxiety that had paralyzed him for years suddenly transmuted into a fierce, blinding, and highly destructive energy. He walked to the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a massive, heavy-duty black garbage bag. The plastic snapped sharply as he shook it open, the sound echoing loudly in the cramped space, signaling the violent, irreversible beginning of an incredibly painful, deeply emotional, and profoundly liberating war against his own material attachments. He approached the first towering pile of neglected objects, his hands trembling slightly, suspended between the terrifying comfort of the known past and the terrifying, blank canvas of a completely unknown future. The arduous, bloody, and entirely necessary journey of letting go had officially, irrevocably commenced. The sharp, violent snap of the heavy plastic garbage bag hung in the stagnant, suffocating air of the cluttered apartment. A definitive, percussive starting gun for a grueling psychological war that had been desperately delayed for years. The minimalist gripped the thin black plastic, his knuckles white with tension, staring intensely into the dense, chaotic archaeology of his own fractured past. The very first layer of this daunting excavation was deceptively simple, lulling him into a highly fragile, false sense of momentum. He aggressively swept obvious, undeniable garbage, expired receipts, dried-out ink pens, broken plastic hangers, and empty containers, into the yawning, dark mouth of the bag. But this superficial clearing was merely the gentle, forgiving shallow end of a deeply terrifying, entirely uncharted emotional ocean. Within mere minutes of digging deeper into the strata of his belongings, he violently, unexpectedly collided with the first massive, heavily fortified psychological barrier, the insidious, paralyzing, and deeply toxic delusion of someday. He stood completely frozen before a towering, incredibly dusty stack of complex foreign language textbooks and advanced, highly specialized, and prohibitively expensive cooking equipment that had never, not even once, seen the searing heat of a kitchen flame. These specific objects were absolutely not mere bound paper and polished steel, they were incredibly heavy, deeply emotional physical anchors tied directly to a phantom, idealized version of himself. They represented the fluent, cosmopolitan world traveler and the sophisticated, highly cultured master chef he desperately deeply wished to be perceived as, but persistently, fundamentally lacked the grueling, unglamorous daily discipline to actually manifest into reality, to physically place these pristine, entirely unused objects into a trash bag meant for refuse felt entirely sickeningly different from simply discarding old mail. It felt like committing a brutal, unforgiving, and deeply premeditated act of murder against his own infinite potential. It was the violent, agonizing, and profoundly tragic death of a deeply cherished personal fantasy. Analyzing this excruciating cognitive dissonance exposes the ultimate, tragic, and highly manipulative flaw of aspirational accumulation. The human ego is an incredibly fragile, deeply insecure entity, constantly, desperately seeking easy, frictionless shortcuts to completely avoid the searing, transformative pain of actual, sustained effort. Buying the incredibly heavy, dense textbook or the elite cooking apparatus provides a sudden, intoxicating, and entirely unearned rush of chemical dopamine, brilliantly tricking the exhausted brain into feeling a false, soaring sense of accomplishment simply and entirely through the effortless act of a financial transaction. We feel incredibly productive simply because our credit card was successfully charged. But the object then sits abandoned on the shelf, slowly, inevitably mutating from a brilliant, shining beacon of hope into a glaring, daily, and highly oppressive monument to our own procrastination, laziness, and failure. The minimalist realized, with a rushing, icy wave of profound, earth-shattering clarity, that, someday, is a completely fictional, entirely non-existent destination on the calendar of human existence. It is a toxic, paralyzing lie we continuously tell ourselves to deeply, comfortably excuse our chronic present inaction. He ruthlessly applied a new, terrifyingly sharp mental scalpel to the towering pile before him. He accepted, with brutal, unflinching honesty, that he was absolutely never going to learn conversational French or master complex culinary arts in this current, exhausted season of his life. He forcefully, aggressively shoved the heavy textbooks and the pristine equipment deep into the black plastic bag, feeling a sudden, violent, and deeply painful tear in his own ego, which was followed almost instantly by a strange, breathtaking, and incredibly intoxicating rush of light, airy relief. He was no longer carrying the suffocating, crushing weight of unfulfilled, imaginary futures on his tired shoulders. He was brutally, beautifully forcing his mind to finally, entirely reside in the raw, unpolished, and completely undeniable reality of the present moment. But the battlefield of his apartment only grew exponentially more treacherous, heavily littered with the highly explosive, deeply psychological landmines of the sunk cost fallacy. He slowly moved to the crammed, overflowing closet, deeply confronting a dense, suffocating wall of incredibly expensive, highly trendy designer clothing, many garments still absurdly bearing their original, crisp retail tags hanging from the sleeves. He pulled out a heavy, luxurious, and wildly impractical vintage coat that he had frantically purchased during a manic, drunken, and deeply depressed online shopping binge months prior. It did not fit his physical body comfortably. It absolutely did not match his actual, mundane daily lifestyle. But his brain immediately, violently rebelled at the very thought of discarding it into the trash. The mind screamed in sheer, unadulterated financial terror, agonizing over the hundreds of dollars of finite, irreplaceable life energy that had been permanently, foolishly traded for the woven fabric. To throw the expensive coat away felt exactly like actively, aggressively burning a massive pile of hard-earned cash in the dead center of the cramped room. Yet, the narrative introduces a profound, highly strategic, and deeply psychological questioning framework that completely, beautifully neutralizes this specific, paralyzing economic terror. The minimalist held the heavy coat in his trembling hands and asked himself a single, piercing, and entirely unforgiving question: if I somehow lost this exact item today? Or if my apartment tragically burned to the ground and I miraculously received a massive, comprehensive insurance payout, would I immediately rush out into the city and consciously choose to purchase this exact same coat again at full retail price? The immediate, undeniable, and resounding biological answer echoing loudly in his mind was a definitive, absolute, no. This incredibly powerful, highly analytical realization cleanly, violently severed the heavy, emotional tether to the past financial mistake. He understood, with profound clarity, that the money was completely, permanently gone the very millisecond the original, foolish transaction was digitally processed, keeping the unworn, heavy coat in his cramped, incredibly expensive closet was not somehow magically, retroactively recovering that lost currency. It was actually drastically compounding the devastating error by forcing him to continuously, painfully pay exorbitant Tokyo real estate rent to carefully store a daily, highly visible, and deeply humiliating reminder of his own impulsive stupidity. The true, hidden, and incredibly heavy cost of the object was the continuous, agonizing drain on his daily psychological bandwidth. He aggressively shoved the expensive, tagged garments into the dark bag, fully accepting the sharp sting of the financial loss as the highly necessary, incredibly painful, and entirely unavoidable tuition fee required to finally enroll in the lifelong masterclass of mindful, highly conscious consumption. As the grueling days turned into emotionally exhausting, physically draining weeks, the massive mountain of black plastic bags growing ominously by the front door began to physically represent a massive, heavy exodus of his past trauma and deep insecurities. But the final, absolute hardest, and most terrifying boss of this psychological war still patiently awaited him in the dark, forgotten, and deeply dusty corners of the room, the highly charged, incredibly dense, and heavily radioactive material of sentimental items. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, completely surrounded by fragile, fading photographs, deeply personal handwritten letters from long-forgotten ex-lovers, and bizarre, entirely useless decorative souvenirs gifted by well-meaning relatives from distant, decades-old vacations. These specific items were absolutely not functional, practical tools or fake, aspirational props. They were the heavy, deeply ingrained physical manifestations of profound human connection, deep affection, and completely irrecoverable, highly cherished memories. To casually discard a heartfelt, handwritten letter felt like a sociopathic, deeply callous act of emotional betrayal. It felt like violently, aggressively erasing the person who wrote it from the very fabric of human history and actively denying that the love ever existed. The anxiety was entirely crushing, heavily paralyzing his hands, tightening his throat, and bringing hot, stinging tears of intense guilt to his exhausted eyes. The narrative deeply, meticulously analyzes this profound emotional paralysis, revealing a fundamental, tragic, and entirely universal misunderstanding of how human memory actually, biologically functions. We deeply, falsely, and incredibly dangerously conflate the physical, decaying artifact with the invisible, immortal emotional bond. We terrifyingly believe that if the fragile, yellowing paper is destroyed or the ceramic souvenir is shattered, the love, the joy, and the memory it represents will completely, permanently vanish into the cold, silent ether. But the minimalist, fiercely fighting through the thick, suffocating, and deeply blinding fog of societal guilt, forced himself to aggressively realize that true, enduring human relationships and deeply cherished, foundational memories do absolutely not require a dusty, decaying, and heavily burdensome physical shrine to survive. He adopted a deeply modern, highly efficient, and incredibly liberating technological bridge to successfully cross this terrifying emotional chasm. He meticulously, carefully, and highly respectfully scanned the fragile letters and completely digitized the fading photographs, permanently, flawlessly preserving the visual and textual data in an incredibly secure, weightless, and entirely invisible digital cloud, completely stripping the heavy, beautiful memories of their cumbersome physical mass. He then deeply realized a profound, heavily liberating, and entirely world-altering truth about the fundamental nature of human gifting. The true, ultimate, and highest purpose of any gift is completely, entirely fulfilled in the exact, fleeting, and highly emotional moment it is warmly received and genuine gratitude is warmly expressed. The physical object itself is merely the temporary, disposable vehicle for the deeply emotional transaction. Once the love is successfully delivered and fully received, the physical vehicle is no longer a sacred, untouchable, and heavily demanding idol that must be dutifully hoarded. dusted, and protected for decades, he silently, deeply thanked the physical objects for the brief, warm joy they once provided in his past. And he gently, firmly, and completely let them go into the absolute darkness of the final bag. Months of relentless, agonizing, and incredibly bloody psychological warfare finally, beautifully culminated in a breathtaking, staggering, and deeply echoing visual silence. The minimalist stood entirely alone in the very dead center of his Tokyo apartment. The towering, claustrophobic, and deeply terrifying mountains of chaotic clutter had been completely, entirely, and ruthlessly eradicated from his existence. The room was utterly, incredibly transformed into something entirely unrecognizable. The previously suffocating space now contained only a simple, incredibly thin white futon mattress neatly, precisely folded in the corner. A small, highly functional, and deeply unassuming wooden table resting on the floor, and a meticulously curated, incredibly minuscule fraction of highly versatile, essential clothing hanging freely in the now cavernous, deeply echoing closet. The sheer visual transformation was absolutely shocking, resembling a pristine, highly curated modern art gallery rather than a human dwelling. But this visual emptiness was incredibly, vastly dwarfed by the massive, earth-shattering psychological and biological revolution violently occurring within his own mind and body. The deafening, relentless, and highly exhausting roar of the silent to-do list had been completely, permanently, and blissfully muted. There were absolutely no dusty, unread books screaming at him to magically become an intellectual, no complex, unused gadgets demanding his exhausted, fragmented attention, and absolutely no towering, chaotic piles of dirty laundry inducing deep, chronic, and highly paralyzing guilt. The ambient air in the room felt physically lighter, highly oxygenated, and incredibly, deeply pure. He was no longer a terrified, paralyzed, and heavily burdened prisoner desperately hiding in his own home. He was standing tall, breathing deeply in a vast, empty, and deeply sacred temple of his own fierce, uncompromising creation. This profound, sweeping, and incredible physical emptiness instantly, miraculously triggered a massive, compounding cascade of incredible, highly unexpected, and deeply profound positive externalities that violently, beautifully rippled through every single, minute aspect of his entire biological and social existence. Because his internal, deeply entrenched psychological anxiety had completely, entirely evaporated alongside the physical clutter, he entirely, miraculously lost the desperate, primal, and highly destructive urge to chemically numb his own brain. The excessive, daily, and highly depressing alcohol consumption completely, instantly ceased without any strained effort, and the frantic, stress-induced, and deeply unhealthy overeating stopped entirely in its tracks. He effortlessly, naturally, and incredibly rapidly shed massive amounts of stagnant physical body weight. His newly lean, highly energized physical form perfectly, beautifully mirroring the dramatic, incredible reduction of his external material possessions. The daily, exhausting, and deeply frustrating friction of simply existing as a modern human was completely, beautifully, and permanently eradicated. Deciding exactly what to wear in the early morning, previously a deeply stressful, time-consuming, and highly anxious daily crisis of fragile self-identity, now took an effortless, joyful, and deeply liberating 5 seconds because his vastly reduced closet contained only a few highly cherished, perfectly fitting, and deeply versatile garments that he absolutely loved. The grueling, hours-long, and highly dreaded chore of deep cleaning his chaotic, cluttered apartment, which he used to fiercely avoid and deeply resent for entirely suffocating months on end, was entirely, incredibly reduced to a swift, highly satisfying, and deeply meditative 5-minute daily sweep of the vast, completely empty wooden floors. He had successfully, violently, and permanently bought back immense, staggering volumes of his own finite, precious, and highly unrenewable life energy. Because his home was absolutely no longer an exhausting, highly demanding, and deeply depressing warehouse that required his constant, weary, and heavily taxed attention to maintain. He suddenly, miraculously felt a profound, surging, and entirely biological desire to actually leave its pristine walls, He began to deeply, joyfully, and aggressively crave authentic, vibrant, and highly engaging external human experiences over stagnant, internal, and deeply isolating material accumulation. He actively, enthusiastically sought out deep, meaningful, and entirely unhurried conversations with friends in bustling, warm coffee shops. He took long, highly observant, and deeply peaceful walks through vibrant, crowded city parks, completely unburdened by the urge to shop. And he eagerly, effortlessly planned incredibly lightweight, highly mobile, and deeply adventurous travel experiences with nothing more than a single, tiny backpack. He was absolutely no longer furiously, miserably comparing his deeply flawed, highly chaotic behind-the-scenes reality to the highly curated, impossibly flawless, and entirely artificial highlight reels of other people's massive material wealth, because he had completely, entirely, and permanently exited the toxic, unwinnable, and deeply corrosive game of social and economic comparison. He had violently, permanently, and beautifully opted out of the crushing, heavy, and deeply miserable rat race of modern, limitless consumerism. He was finally, blissfully, and utterly free, standing strong, light, and deeply energized at the absolute, glittering precipice of a completely reimagined, incredibly intentional existence, quietly preparing to fully, deeply explore the profound, heavily spiritual, and deeply philosophical implications of finally discovering his true, highly authentic self, completely naked, deeply vulnerable, and entirely stripped of all external, heavy, and highly fabricated material armor. The profound, echoing silence of the newly emptied apartment was absolutely not merely an acoustic, physical phenomenon. It was a deeply terrifying, highly revealing, and incredibly intense psychological mirror that completely, entirely forced the minimalist to violently confront the most uncomfortable, heavily avoided, and deeply existential question of his entire mortal existence. For decades, he had meticulously, desperately, and with incredible financial cost constructed a highly elaborate, incredibly heavy suit of material armor, using complex vintage cameras, towering, sagging bookshelves, and expensive, heavily branded designer clothing to artificially project a highly curated, entirely fabricated, and deeply insecure identity to the completely indifferent, rushing outside world. When he bravely, ruthlessly stripped away every single piece of that heavy, physical, and deeply exhausting scaffolding, he was left standing entirely naked, deeply vulnerable, and completely exposed in the dead, echoing center of the barren, sunlit room. There were absolutely no more impressive, expensive, and highly distracting props left to hide behind. No towering, physical monuments of purchased, aspirational culture to silently, desperately scream his supposed intellectual worth to casually visiting guests. He was forced, with brutal, unflinching, and highly terrifying honesty, to look directly at the raw, unpolished, entirely unadorned, and deeply authentic reality of his actual, breathing, and highly finite self. The initial, crashing shock of this profound, self-inflicted material nakedness was incredibly paralyzing, inducing a severe, temporary, and highly agonizing crisis of identity, precisely because the highly conditioned, heavily brainwashed, and deeply fragile human ego is absolutely terrified of existing without its expensive, external, and highly visible validating markers. But as the quiet, deeply peaceful, and incredibly uninterrupted days slowly, beautifully, and gracefully unfolded into sprawling weeks, this terrifying, initial vulnerability miraculously, profoundly, and entirely transmuted into an unshakable, deeply rooted, incredibly fierce, and entirely invincible form of psychological sovereignty. He deeply, viscerally, and mathematically realized that his intrinsic, fundamental, and highly sacred value as a living, breathing, and profoundly unique human being was absolutely, entirely, and permanently independent of the fluctuating market value of the inanimate, decaying objects he had previously, desperately hoarded. He was absolutely not the heavy, rapidly depreciating vehicle he drove. He was completely not the expensive, highly branded, and deeply uncomfortable fabric draped heavily over his shoulders. He was absolutely, undeniably not the massive, chaotic, and deeply intimidating collection of unread, dusty books collecting silent judgment on a sagging wooden shelf. He was, in his absolute purest, most profound, and deeply unshakable essence, simply a conscious, fiercely experiencing entity, entirely complete, fundamentally whole, and utterly flawless exactly as he currently stood, without desperately needing to artificially, expensively add a single, solitary physical atom to his daily existence. This staggering, earth-shattering, and profoundly liberating realization completely, permanently, and violently destroyed the toxic, heavily ingrained, and incredibly malicious societal lie that basic human worth must be actively, desperately, and continuously purchased in a brightly lit, heavily marketed retail store. He had finally, beautifully, and permanently decoupled his fragile, internal, and highly sensitive soul from the chaotic, heavily manipulated, deeply cynical, and entirely exhausting external supply chain of endless global consumerism. As the incredibly heavy, suffocating, and deeply paralyzing burden of maintaining, organizing, fiercely protecting, and deeply worrying about thousands upon thousands of physical, decaying possessions completely, permanently evaporated from his daily, breathing reality, the minimalist experienced a massive, incomprehensible, entirely breathtaking, and deeply magical expansion of the absolute most precious, highly unrenewable, and fiercely ticking resource in the known universe, finite, mortal human time. Previously, his incredibly short, highly anticipated weekends were entirely, miserably, and violently consumed by the exhausting, deeply frustrating, and totally mind-numbing chores of aggressively cleaning a chaotic, deeply cluttered, and heavily soiled apartment, frantically, desperately searching through dense, suffocating mountains of disorganized, chaotic belongings for lost, essential items, and mindlessly, obsessively wandering through massive, brightly lit, and highly engineered shopping malls to continuously purchase even more heavy, unnecessary anchors for his deeply sinking, rapidly taking on watership. Now, his entire, completely unburdened, highly minimalist, and incredibly pristine living space could be flawlessly, meticulously, and beautifully cleaned to a brilliant, sparkling, and entirely dust-free shine in a mere, deeply meditative, and highly satisfying 5 minutes. This incredible, massive, and entirely unprecedented surplus of newly reclaimed, completely sovereign, and fiercely protected time violently, beautifully, and entirely shifted his complete paradigm of human existence from the frantic, desperate, and highly anxious act of continuous having to the profound, deeply resonant, highly intentional, and entirely peaceful act of conscious experiencing, because his physical environment was absolutely, perfectly, and beautifully silent. His heavily fractured, intensely exhausted, and deeply abused attention span began to slowly, miraculously, and highly profoundly heal and deeply consolidate. He found himself incredibly, entirely capable of sitting completely still on the empty, warm, sunlit wooden floor, deeply, completely, and intensely absorbed in the incredibly simple, profoundly beautiful act of slowly drinking a single, steaming cup of green tea, entirely unbothered, completely untethered, and entirely unbothered by the frantic, screaming, and highly toxic demands of a cluttered, chaotic, and deeply suffocating room. The highly mundane, entirely ordinary, and previously completely ignored moments of daily human existence suddenly, miraculously, and violently blossomed with an intense, breathtaking, highly saturated, and entirely vivid cinematic clarity. He deeply, profoundly noticed the delicate, incredibly beautiful, and highly intricate shifting patterns of natural sunlight slowly crawling across the bare, entirely empty white walls. He felt the deep, profound, highly biological, and entirely calming rhythm of his own rising and falling breath. He genuinely, deeply, and intensely listened to the intricate, fascinating, and highly emotional cadence of his friends' voices without constantly, anxiously, and rudely checking a highly distracting, vibrating digital screen or silently, neurotically worrying about his messy, chaotic, and deeply embarrassing home. The profound, staggering, and incredibly beautiful irony of this massive, highly arduous transformation was that by aggressively, ruthlessly, and violently eliminating almost absolutely everything he previously owned. He had miraculously, beautifully, and entirely gained absolute, unfettered, and completely unlimited access to the entire, boundless, highly vibrant, and deeply magnificent universe of the absolute present moment. He deeply, fundamentally, and irrevocably understood that true, enduring, and entirely unshakable human happiness is absolutely not a distant, heavily guarded, and highly exclusive destination to be finally, desperately reached after exhausting oneself purchasing the perfect, flawless combination of expensive, highly depreciating luxury goods. It is a quiet, highly accessible, deeply profound, and entirely internal state of being that miraculously, beautifully emerges only when you completely, permanently, and violently remove the heavy, blinding, highly toxic, and entirely deafening static of excessive, endless material desire. The profound, internal biological, and deeply psychological healing was absolutely, undeniably magnificent, but the sweeping narrative forcefully, critically, and highly aggressively analyzes the ultimate, most liberating, and deeply invincible external victory of this arduous, deeply transformative, and highly emotional journey, the complete, total, violent, and highly permanent death of the deeply toxic, highly corrosive, entirely unwinnable, and deeply miserable game of constant social and economic comparison. Modern, hyper-connected, and deeply heavily commercialized society operates strictly on a vicious, deeply cruel, highly visible, and entirely unforgiving hierarchy of relentless material accumulation. We are constantly, relentlessly, and deeply subconsciously ranking our fragile selves and absolutely everyone breathing around us based entirely and incredibly superficially on the exact, heavily mortgaged square footage of the sprawling house, the prestigious, highly polished, and incredibly shiny emblem mounted on the expensive, depreciating vehicle, and the exclusive, heavily branded, and entirely arbitrary logos stitched aggressively into the thin fabric of our daily clothing. This deeply ingrained, highly competitive, entirely exhausted, and profoundly insecure behavior is a guaranteed, mathematically certain, and completely inescapable recipe for absolute, chronic, and highly paralyzing misery, precisely because no matter how incredibly wealthy, highly successful, or heavily, densely accumulated you manage to violently become, there will always, inevitably, perpetually, and undeniably be someone else standing further up the endless, exhausting, and highly slippery ladder, effortlessly possessing a slightly larger, highly polished yacht, a slightly faster, incredibly loud sports car, or a slightly more exclusive, heavily guarded, and deeply envious luxury experience. The minimalist, standing entirely alone, deeply grounded, and highly empowered in his perfectly empty, deeply peaceful, and incredibly pristine room, violently, aggressively, beautifully, and permanently stepped completely off this heavily rigged, deeply cynical, entirely exhausting, and highly destructive treadmill, because he had voluntarily, joyfully, incredibly bravely, and highly intentionally chosen to live with absolutely almost nothing. He had completely, entirely, and permanently removed his entire biological and psychological existence from the brutal, competitive, and deeply toxic ranking system of the heavily manipulated material world. When he calmly, peacefully walked down the bustling, incredibly chaotic, neon-lit, and highly crowded streets of Tokyo, completely surrounded by highly targeted, aggressive, entirely blinding advertising and frantic, desperate, and highly exhausted consumers, he looked at the incredibly expensive, highly polished luxury goods displayed aggressively in the pristine glass windows, not with burning, painful, and deeply insecure envy, but with a profound, deeply peaceful, highly observant, and entirely untouchable indifference. He genuinely, deeply, and physically felt absolutely no burning, insecure, or desperate desire to violently trade his massive, hard-won, incredibly light, and highly protected psychological freedom for the heavy, suffocating, entirely exhausting, and highly stressful burden of continuous ownership. He was completely, utterly, mathematically, and biologically invincible to the highly manipulative, incredibly sophisticated, fear-based marketing tactics that relentlessly, aggressively preyed upon the fragile, bleeding insecurities of the exhausted, sleeping masses. He deeply, profoundly, and incredibly powerfully realized that the ultimate, most terrifying, and entirely unassailable flex of true, unshakable wealth and absolute, undeniable power in the modern, hyper-commercialized, and deeply frantic world is absolutely not possessing everything in a massive, sprawling warehouse, but possessing the incredible, fierce, entirely sovereign, and deeply beautiful ability to look at absolutely everything the loud, screaming world furiously demands you must immediately buy, and calmly, joyfully, peacefully, and completely genuinely saying, "No, thank you, I am entirely full, I am perfectly whole, and I already have absolutely everything I could ever possibly, conceivably need to live a magnificent life." However, the incredibly intense narrative aggressively, urgently, and highly carefully warns against a highly dangerous, deeply seductive, entirely common, and incredibly toxic misinterpretation of this profound, beautiful philosophy that frequently, tragically traps eager, newly awakened, and highly zealous practitioners. It is absolutely, critically, undeniably vital to deeply, fundamentally understand that minimalism, in its absolute purest, most authentic, highly functional, and deeply human form, is absolutely not a rigid, heavily dogmatic, incredibly punishing, and deeply austere aesthetic religion. The ultimate, shining, and highly coveted goal of this arduous, highly emotional, and deeply transformative journey is absolutely not to frantically, desperately, and highly competitively race against other individuals to see who can physically, painfully own the fewest, absolute mathematically smallest, and most microscopic number of total items, nor is it to aggressively force oneself to painfully live in a miserable, barren, deeply uncomfortable, and entirely cold state of extreme, punishing physical deprivation simply and entirely for the sake of abstract, ideological, and deeply arrogant purity. The minimalist profoundly, deeply, and intensely realized that the bloody, exhausting process of aggressively, ruthlessly discarding his heavy possessions was absolutely not the final, triumphant, and highly celebrated destination. It was merely the highly effective, incredibly sharp, and beautifully precise surgical scalpel used to violently, beautifully, and entirely cut away the cancerous, suffocating, heavily draining, and deeply toxic tumor of continuous material distraction. Minimalism is entirely, fundamentally, and beautifully a highly practical, incredibly powerful, and deeply intentional utility tool designed specifically, exclusively to violently, aggressively clear the heavy, physical, highly chaotic, and deeply psychological debris completely off the runway of your finite, unrenewable, and rapidly ticking life, entirely so that the specific, incredible things that truly, absolutely, undeniably, and profoundly matter can finally, beautifully, and powerfully take off and soar into the boundless sky. The specific, highly individual things that truly, deeply matter will inevitably, beautifully, and incredibly naturally vary from one unique, highly complex human soul to another. For one specific individual, it might absolutely be dedicating massive, completely unburdened, and entirely undistracted time to raising a loving, deeply connected, and highly emotionally secure family. For another entirely different person, it might literally be pouring explosive, highly focused, completely uninterrupted, and deeply passionate creative energy into writing a profound, world-altering, and highly impactful novel. For yet another entirely distinct soul, it might simply, beautifully be the quiet, peaceful, incredibly light, and entirely unhurried ability to freely travel the vast, beautiful, and highly diverse world with nothing more than a tiny, incredibly efficient, and deeply liberating backpack. The profound, underlying, entirely magical power of this incredibly transformative, highly emotional philosophy lies entirely, fundamentally in its incredible, fierce, and highly ruthless ability to aggressively, violently eliminate the meaningless, heavy, deeply chaotic, and entirely exhausting excess, thereby brilliantly, beautifully, and entirely illuminating the absolute, undeniably essential, and incredibly sacred core of your own, specific, highly intentional, and entirely unique human existence. You absolutely do not aggressively, Painfully empty your highly valuable physical space to merely sit and stare blankly. Miserably at the cold, bare, white walls, you empty your incredibly valuable, highly finite, and fiercely protected physical space entirely, completely, and absolutely so that you can finally, fully, deeply, and incredibly passionately fill your incredibly brief, highly unrepeatable, and fiercely ticking mortal life with breathtaking, vibrant, highly emotional, and entirely unforgettable human experiences. The sweeping, incredibly emotional, deeply psychological, and highly profound narrative brings the deeply awakened, profoundly transformed, and entirely liberated reader to a breathtaking, high-altitude, incredibly panoramic, and deeply majestic view of the minimalist's fully realized, incredibly light, highly potent, and deeply intentional daily existence. He has successfully, flawlessly, and beautifully completed the grueling, bloody, highly emotional, and entirely necessary war against his own heavy, incredibly toxic material attachments. He has absolutely, permanently, violently, and beautifully conquered the terrifying, paralyzing, highly exhausting, and deeply toxic anxiety of the endless, screaming, and entirely invisible, silent to-do list. He has successfully, beautifully, and highly strategically engineered an incredibly robust, deeply peaceful, completely unshakable, and highly sovereign daily reality where his internal, profound, highly sacred human value is completely, irrevocably, permanently, and entirely decoupled from his external, highly temporary, entirely meaningless physical possessions. The heavy, dark, incredibly suffocating, and deeply exhausting storm clouds of chronic, heavily manipulated consumerism have entirely, permanently, and violently broken apart, miraculously revealing a vast, incredibly bright, deeply limitless, and entirely boundless sky of pure, unadulterated, highly energized, and fiercely protected personal freedom. He moves effortlessly through the chaotic, bustling, highly demanding, and incredibly loud modern world with the incredible, frictionless, entirely silent grace of a ghost, entirely unburdened, deeply observant, incredibly peaceful, and profoundly, fiercely alive, the ultimate, earth-shattering, incredibly profound meaning that, goodbye, things, fiercely, aggressively, and beautifully intends to convey to its exhausted readers as a complete, violent, highly intellectual, and entirely spiritual revolution against the deeply entrenched, globally accepted, incredibly toxic dogma that human happiness, profound internal peace, and ultimate, undeniable success must be continuously, heavily purchased, aggressively hoarded, frantically maintained, and anxiously protected in a massive, physical, heavily mortgaged warehouse of decaying, utterly meaningless matter. The core, beating, highly profound, and completely undeniable message is that the prevailing, relentless, highly manipulated mandate to blindly, endlessly, and frantically consume is a massive, carefully orchestrated, highly destructive, and deeply cynical illusion designed entirely, specifically to harvest your precious, finite time, aggressively drain your limited biological energy, and keep you completely, perpetually enslaved to a deep, agonizing, highly profitable state of quiet, unfulfilled, and completely entirely unnecessary desperation. The book serves brilliantly as a profound, transformative, incredibly sharp, and highly psychological blueprint, teaching absolutely that by aggressively, ruthlessly, and entirely abandoning the deeply toxic, highly corrosive comparison game, heavily, fiercely prioritizing the uncompromising resolution of internal, profound peace over the exhausting, continuous projection of external, highly fabricated status, and rigorously, meticulously engineering a highly curated, entirely intentional physical environment violently stripped of all chaotic, highly demanding excess. You can effectively, beautifully hack the universe and violently, completely accelerate the deep, profound, and entirely liberating discovery of your true, highly authentic, entirely unshakable self. The final, transcendent, incredibly powerful, and completely unshakable lesson is one of radical, terrifying, beautifully uncompromising, and entirely absolute liberation. You absolutely do not ever need to frantically, desperately acquire the entire, heavy, screaming world to finally feel profoundly complete, you simply, deeply, profoundly need to possess the fierce, incredible, entirely sovereign courage to let the vast majority of it completely, permanently, and beautifully go. Your ultimate, unassailable freedom begins the exact, breathtaking moment you finally realize that the less you aggressively hold onto, the more intensely, profoundly, and beautifully you can actually live.